Okay. And wanted to make sure my folks are back where they can help. So I'm going to cover a lot of stuff, and if you have any questions, just, hey, I have a question. So I'm going to start with why we go with heirlooms instead of not heirlooms. So just to explain really quick, there's a couple of differences that people get confused in. With GMOs, people will say like, I don't want to grow GMOs. You can't grow GMOs. They're only available to commercial farmers. And currently right now, the only GMO tomato that's been made is not available in the United States. So you're not going to accidentally get a GMO tomato that you're either eating or growing. They just don't exist yet. But what is mostly out there is hybrids. And the difference between what we grow, the heirlooms, and the hybrids is that a hybrid you cannot save seeds from it and grow another plant from it. You'll get a parent, you won't get the plant that you were growing. And the reason that hybrids exist, the main reason, is that they're being bred for disease resistance. They're being bred for production, where they produce commercially all at once so that they can be picked, and the workers don't have to go out in the fields and keep picking and keep picking. They just pick them all at once. And that they're uniform. So they are perfectly round. They don't have any cracks in them. They're not misshapen. But the way that they breed them, they are not breeding for flavor. And the heirlooms have way more flavor in them than the hybrids do. Now, that doesn't mean that heirlooms are harder to grow, because heirlooms are basically plants that people have been cultivating for up to 50 years or more. And when they're cultivating them, like, you know, your grandpa Joe that was growing this tomato for 50 years, he was growing it for it to be preserved or to be put up or to be eaten, like to feed the family. And so they do produce well. They do have disease resistance, but there are literally thousands of different varieties of just heirloom tomatoes, and they were specialized in the area that the person was growing them in. So the trick is to find out for your soil, for your growing conditions, what is the best plant that is an heirloom that is going to produce in what you are growing it in. And that just takes testing it. We've been testing heirlooms for over 20 years. We are now on this property, so what we're finding is some of the ones we absolutely loved on our old property don't do well on this one because the soil is different. And so we're crossing some of them off and replacing them with others. And that's what you do in heirlooms. A lot of people that have been buying from us for several years, they're like, I've got my ones that I get every single year, but I'm gonna test a couple of them over here to see if I can grow this one. And they'll land on those, place an order for them, and then come and just, you know, buy extras off the tables. But they've got to have, I've got to have this one, I've got to have this one. And so we do the same thing. Now the last thing in the different kinds of tomatoes are open pollinated. And this is where it gets kind of muddy. So you know how like some people call things an antique, but it's not really an antique unless it's at least 50 years old? Same thing with heirlooms. It's technically not an heirloom if it is not at least 50 years old. The variety has not been stabilized for 50 years. If it's under 50 years, but it's stabilized, it's open pollinated. So all heirlooms are open pollinated, but not all open pollinated are heirlooms. So if the plant has only been stabilized for 5 or 6 years, it's considered open pollinated, but not an heirloom, because it hasn't been around long enough. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So what open pollinated means is just that variety has been stabilized. It is, if you save seed from it, you will get the same plant the next year. And the beautiful thing about tomatoes, not so with peppers or eggplants, but tomatoes, is that the male and the female are in the same flower. So they very rarely will ever cross-pollinate in your garden, so that you won't get two tomatoes that have played with each other and you end up with a hybrid the next year. All it takes for a tomato to pollinate a flower is for the wind to slightly blow, and it shakes the flower, and the male pollinates the female because it's all in the same flower. So when they hybridize them, they have to go in and remove the male part of the flower so that it doesn't accidentally vibrate when it's ready to pollinate. And then they have to put the pollen of what they're going to hybridize into the female flower to get it to produce the hybrid. And you'll notice that, like, if you look through seed catalogs or you go to Home Depot and you look at your little labels and it says hybrid, it'll say F1, and F1 means that it's only one generation. So you are guaranteed that if you save those seeds and you plant them, you will not get what you just had. And the growers that have developed that hybrid tomato want it that way. They don't want you to know what the two were that were crossed, because that's how they make their money. And you know, there's nothing wrong with that, but they keep that under lock and key. So your ace or your better boy tomato, you're like, well, I just want to grow them myself from my seeds. You can't do it, because they're not going to let you know what it was that they crossed to get them to come out, and the seeds aren't any good. So the reason that heirlooms are so important, besides the fact that they taste way better than any hybrid that ever existed, is that we need diversity in the types of plants that we're growing. And a lot of the heirlooms were being lost because grandpa wasn't passing it down to his kids, or the kids didn't care because they stopped gardening. And so they didn't pass it down to their kids. So a lot of these varieties that were 100 years old or more just disappeared. And several years ago, over 20 years ago, an heirloom push came around where people started realizing these plants we're losing them. And we're ending up with hybrids that nobody can save and nobody can keep them going, except for the grower that's keeping them under lock and key. And so if that grower disappears, that variety disappears. And so we want to cultivate as much and have as much diversity in all the varieties that we have. So that's where the heirlooms are great. Anything you buy from us, you can save the seeds from. You can plant the seeds, grow the plants yourself, and you're going to get exactly the same plant that you had the next year. You can grow it year after year after year, and then you can give seeds to your kids, and they can pass them down to their kids, and they can pass them down to their kids. And you can also name it whatever you want, because there can be multiple people who've named the same exact variety multiple different names. And that's one of the fun things when we're testing stuff. We're like, okay, wait a second, we're already growing this thing, but it's called something different. And so we'll usually cross it off because we only need one of them. But you have to just find the stuff that is doing well in your area. And for us, we're growing right in our area. So unless you came from Michigan, you're growing in very similar situation to what we're growing in. Your soil is going to be different, or your growing conditions are going to be different, but there's different things that you can do to make them do well. And if a plant does not do well and all of your conditions are good, make a note of it and don't buy it next year, because there's something that particular variety does not like. So does that all make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, so with that being said, there are a couple of different types of leaf, and I brought them up here to kind of show you for a couple different reasons, because people will ask us, why does this plant look so funny? There are three types of leaf in tomatoes. There's the standard one. This is the one everybody usually remembers because it's like the standard leaf tomato. See how big the leaves are on this guy? This is called potato leaf. And there's nothing good or bad about a potato leaf. It's just that it's a different leaf than the standard leaf. This is where we get into kind of tricky. This is fern leaf. The leaves are a little bit thinner and wispier. They're great tomatoes. We have a really hard time selling them because everybody thinks they're wilting and dying, because they're a fern leaf variety, so they kind of droop. The leaf kind of droops. I guarantee you, if I have something that's like wilting and looks like it's dying, it doesn't go out for sale. So if you see something that looks kind of droopy, it's probably a fern leaf variety, and it does not affect how well what the plants taste like, or the tomatoes taste like. So you can You can have peace about it, that they're still good and there's nothing going wrong with your plants. Your plants will still get big, they'll still look droopy, and you're not killing them. They're just a fern leaf variety.
Did anybody else not know that there was 3 different varieties of leaves? I didn't know.
Yay! I taught you something. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about tomatoes. I want to just touch on peppers and eggplants on saving seeds from them. It is different. They have a male flower and a female flower. If you guys have ever gone to like a farmer's market and you see summer squash and it looks like a zucchini and a yellow squash like had babies because they're like all mottled and different colored, it's because the plants have a big huge male flower and a big huge female flower, and in order for them to pollinate they need pollinators like our bees and our hoverflies. They go in and get the pollen on them and then they go into the female flower and they pollinate them, so they cross. And if the plants are too close together, you'll cross a zucchini with a crookneck, with a patty pan, with a like all these different squash. And those are really like they cross-pollinate really easily because the flower is so big and so many insects get in there and spread the pollen around. So the only way to guarantee that you don't get them to cross is to either have them planted really far away from each other or to bag the female and hand pollinate it in order to guarantee that you're getting that plant. Peppers and eggplants are the same way. The only difference is the flower is really little. So you're not going to have them cross-pollinate as easily, but they can still cross-pollinate if a bee just gets over there and goes over to the next one and crosses them. And so sometimes your sweet little banana pepper, one year you save the seeds and then you go and grow the plant. It looks exactly the same, but it crossed with a jalapeno. And you're like, woo, that's not so sweet. So keeping them separate if you're going to save seeds is important. And the same thing with the eggplants. If you just, usually about 20 feet apart is enough to keep them, the pollinators, from jumping right over and crossing them. But if you ever grow them out and they've been crossed, you could either name it something new, name it after your favorite grandparent and start growing it, or you can just toss the seeds and grow it again the next year and try it again. So, but that just doesn't happen very often with tomatoes. Okay, so preparing your guys' soil. I've got all kinds of stuff here to show you how to do certain things. The biggest thing if you are growing in the ground is to amend your soil. And you need to amend it with compost. And if your compost does not smell like dirt, it is not done composting. And so it's really important, especially like if you go to places where you buy compost, where they load it in the back of your truck, it's loose. That's usually city compost, like it's all that green waste you guys have to put in your little cans that they've made into compost, and they sell it while it's still cooking. So it'll smell like ammonia, and a lot of times it's still steaming. And if you use that and then put your plants in the ground, you'll burn your plants. So compost, that if you can find a compost source or like go to Lowe's and where they say compost, make a little hole in the bag. Don't tell them I said to do this, but smell inside. And if it smells like dirt, then it's good. But if it smells like ammonia or it smells like manure, it is not done cooking, and it doesn't mean it's bad. It means you need to not plant right after you put it in the ground. So well-seasoned compost, and when it's well-seasoned, you can put more on it than you ever thought possible. You can go 4 inches, you can go 2 feet, you can plant your plants right into the compost, and they'll love it and be happy, or just turn it into your soil. Same thing with raised beds. You need to add compost, and you need to do it every single year, every single growing season, because that's what the plants are feeding off of mostly and what's keeping them healthy. Fertilizer then goes with the compost. If your compost is really rich, your fertilizer may be good. We don't ever trust that, even though we make our own compost. So we add fertilizer. And one of the things that is the biggest mistakes that people make is they go to the store and they're like, well, like this one says tomato. but you'll buy one that says all purpose and it has a picture of a tomato on the front of it. So you're like, well, clearly it's good for tomatoes because it's got a tomato on the front of it. That is not true. It's very poor advertising. What you want when you buy your fertilizers, I did this bag because it has the numbers that you can see. See those 3 numbers right there? Okay, this is called your guaranteed analysis. It's smaller on the back and on the sides of all of your fertilizers, but sometimes they help you out by printing it nice and big. The first 3 numbers in your guaranteed analysis are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash. Your nitrogen, the first number for tomatoes, has to be lower than your next 2 numbers. All-purpose fertilizer, the nitrogen is usually the highest number. And so what you're gonna get if you feed your tomatoes that fertilizer is big, beautiful plants that do not produce fruit. They're just basically like a carb addict eating pasta. They're gonna soak up as much nitrogen and get big and fat and healthy, and the plant has no signal at all that they're in trouble, like that they need to reproduce and set fruit. So they'll just keep growing leaf and growing leaf and growing leaf, and they won't set fruit. So when you're looking for your fertilizers, like this one, the guaranteed analysis on the side of it is 346. So what's the lowest number? 3. It's the first number, right? So that means that your nitrogen is the lowest. And so your tomatoes, it causes them to stress just a little bit because you're kind of starving them of the carbs. So they feel like they're going through withdrawals, and so they start setting fruit. Okay? This is one that we often sprinkle. We only do organic, but you can use chemical fertilizers. Miracle Grow does a tomato fertilizer that has a lower nitrogen level. If you use regular Miracle Grow, it has a really high nitrogen, so it's not good for tomatoes. This is the one that we use the most, and I have a bunch of empty packages because we buy it by the case. This is made by Job's, and it's a spike. And the analysis on this is 274. First number is 2, so it's the lowest, nitrogen is low. There's 50 spikes in each one of these packages, and I think they're like $8 for a package. 8 spikes for every tomato, 6 spikes for every pepper or eggplant. And you literally, they're like this big, and you go boop, 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 and you're done around the plant. Mid-summer, usually around August, we go back and do it again to get them through the rest of the season.
How many spikes per plant?
There 8 for tomatoes, and 6 for peppers and eggplants.
And you put them in right when you plant them.
And we put them in when we plant them, and then we go back and do it again in August. Now, if you have clay soil, you're not going to leach nutrients as fast as we do. We're sand, so sand leaches that nutrient out a lot faster. If you have really heavy clay soil, you may not need to go back in August. That one time may be enough. The nice thing about the spikes is they slowly release the nutrients, so they're not just dumping it. And there are a lot of organics out there that are great for tomatoes, but you just have to check your analysis. Now, when you are growing leafy greens, then you want nitrogen, because that's what makes them grow big and leafy and green. It's just you don't want them for tomatoes. And you can use the low nitrogen for peppers and eggplants too. They do fine on it. They'll still produce well on the low nitrogen, but just make sure tomatoes get low nitrogen. Okay? And then when we're preparing our soil, we have gophers. Does anybody else have gophers? It's like I like Caddyshack. I want to just blow them all up, but we're fighting them all the time. If you were at our tomato tasting, you heard me talk about these. These are gopher cages, and they're really inexpensive. This company actually is in California. We've ordered them and gotten them the next day. But you can also buy them at, I know Morris Nursery has them. I think West Turf Nursery has them. There's 2 in a package. I honestly can't remember. I think they're like $8. for a package. They pop open. These will fit a gallon size tomato, but we use them for our 4-inch pots. They're galvanized so they don't rust. We have some that are over 15 years old, and they usually get thrown away when we dig them up not carefully, and we end up making big holes in them. But when you're digging them up at the end of the season, if you dig them up from the spine instead of from the front or the back, then you don't rip holes in them. But they won't rust, so they're a great investment. And I always say I love the fact that I'm laying in bed at night and thinking about how those gophers are going nuts because they can't get to my tomato plants. So this is what we use as the root guards. And then if anyone has ever used a gopher hawk, this is the best invention in the world because I get the satisfaction of actually going, ha, I gotcha. These things are wonderful. So they come with a little, I should have had it up here, but they have a little thing that you probe for the hole. And then once you've cleared the hole, you stick these things in there and you lock them down. And so the yellow disappears at the top. And then when they spring it, see how there's yellow right there? And then you know you got the gopher, and you pull it up and there's a gopher stuck inside of it. And so I have, oh, this is the probe. So this comes with them. It has this thing in it, and you stick around till you find the hole. And then once you find the hole, you put this in there and you move it around until you make a hole that size, and then you stick this in there. And you can't press down on that wire. You always pull up. You don't, and it says in the instructions that you pull up, don't press down, because you'll crush that thing that's catching them and ruin it. But so we carry these around in our little UTV, and I shove them in, and sometimes you get the smart gopher that figures out how to backfill it, and he sets it off, and you go to pull it up and it's like there's nothing in there. So then I take all 6 of them and I put them, I'm like, at some point you're letting your guard down, and I'm getting you, and I always do. So
Another version of Caddyshack.
it is, without the explosives.
Right.
Yeah, and I'm up to, I think, 5 just this spring. I got 42 of them the first 2 weeks we were on this property. So with these things, so they're awesome. And then the other thing that's really important when you're preparing your beds is to mulch them. If you're doing pots, that's not as important, but if you're doing raised beds or you're doing in the ground, we mulch with straw. That's why we've got straw all over the place. It's well, it's not as cheap as it used to be, but it's cheaper than most other mulches. You just put like this thick of straw around the base of your plants, and it will retain moisture so that you're not having to water them as often. It will keep weeds down so that you don't have weeds competing with your plants for nutrients. But it also, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, it keeps soil, if you're watering, from splashing up onto your plants, which spreads disease. And so by having the mulch down there, it keeps the soil from splashing up onto the leaves. So it makes things a whole lot easier. So we use the straw mulch. And then for our cages and how we support, these things should be outlawed because they're useless, especially for tomatoes. Our tomatoes, the indeterminate tomatoes, get huge. They will crush this thing before you get to May. My peppers crush this thing. So if you've got them and you're like, every time I use them, they fall over, it's because they're stupid. So get rid of them because they're useless. This tomato cage right here, last time we put these together, they cost you about $8. They're probably up to 10 now if you, just because everything's more expensive. At Home Depot or Lowe's, in the concrete department, this is concrete mesh. It comes flat, and all you have to do is cut one end so that you have spikes sticking out. We've got mesh all over the place out there. We grow cucumbers on it. But you cut one end off so you've got spikes sticking out on the side, then overlap it, and then twist the spikes back. And then you've got spikes at the bottom. Some of these guys are 20 years old and they're still going strong. And they're really supportive for the tomatoes. If you have some of these guys that get like 12 feet tall, we used to, at the old place, grow these cage in the ground, mesh open above. so that our trellises were 6 feet tall. They would go all the way to the top, all the way down to the bottom, hit the ground by the end of the season. And so you may have to do that if you have some of the really big varieties, but a lot of the varieties, this is plenty to keep it set, and it's a cheap way to make a cage that's going to last you forever and ever and ever. Now that we're on this property,
What is it called again?
it's concrete mesh. It's going to be in the concrete department at Lowe's and Home Depot. When we got here, because we're growing in such a large number compared to our old place, we are now using what's called field twine, and I love it. It works great if you're going to plant really long rows of tomatoes. If you're not, the cages are going to be better. But when we arrived here and we started growing on field twine, we had all these tomato cages, so that's why now we use them to put signs up everywhere, because they're great for shoving them in the ground and hanging signs and the wind doesn't blow them over. But if you are growing long rows and you want to see how we do field twine, if you come back in April for the sale, we will have our twine going in the garden, and it'll be a lot easier to walk out there and show you how we do it. But the field twine is wonderful because at the end of the season, instead of having to like pull tomato plants out of these cages, we just snip the twine and all the plants fall over, and we cut them at the base and we roll them up and haul them off. And that's important. We haul them off. Do not put your tomatoes, peppers, or eggplants in your compost pile unless you have an O2 composter that will heat it up to 180 degrees. To kill any of the boogers that might be growing on it that could pass it to your plants the next year. Okay? Questions about that? We've got prep. Yeah.
So those, you just don't like them because they fall over? They're
not only do they fall, they're really hard to get in the ground.
Okay.
Then they fall over and they bend because they're not strong enough. The welds on them all break. Because they're just really cheesy welds. So like if you try to do this, you're just going to break all the welds. If you try to do this at the end of the season, you'll break all the welds. There are a couple of like really small pepper plants that we will still use these on, but for the most part we don't. I just have a whole bunch of them and they're useless and frustrating. There is some of the nurseries are now selling the cone planters. They're a lot bigger than this, but they're like really big wire and they're colored. Have you guys seen those? They're expensive. They're really pretty and they hold up nice. So it's not because it's a cone that it's bad. It's just that they're cheesy. They're really flimsy and they can't handle, like literally my bell peppers crush these things. So they're not really useful for holding together. But if you're planting 2 or 3 plants and you want it to look pretty, go to the nurseries and buy some of those ones that they're making that are the big colored ones, because the wire is even heavier than this. It's a really heavy gauge wire and those hold up good, but I think they're like 20, 25 bucks a pop. So, but they're pretty because they're all different colors. Okay, so most common mistakes. The first one I already touched on is the nitrogen, so we won't go over that one again. The second is getting your plants wet. And so when you're watering your tomato plants, you need to either have wells around them that you're filling up with water and letting the water go down and then watering them again, or have them on a drip system. If you are spraying them with a hose, if you are letting sprinklers hit them, you are getting your leaves wet, and that's what spreads disease. The reason that heirlooms do so good in the Central Valley of California is because we are dry and we are hot. In the South or places where it's humid, you'll have people like, I can't grow heirlooms because I've got this blight and this wilt and this, like all these different diseases that spread. The only time we really have a problem with that is if we're getting our plants wet. And if we're planting them so that they're up off the ground, so they're not getting moisture coming up from the ground from crawling on the ground, and the air is going through them, you're not going to have problems with all of the different diseases that tomatoes have a problem with. That is the reason that hybrids exist, to fight off these different diseases. That doesn't mean, like I said, that some of these heirlooms aren't great great disease resistance because they had to cross something with something to get the disease resistance. But sometimes, like when we're doing our test garden and we go through and make notes, we're like, oh, this one's got early blight. And early blight is caused by moisture. And you'll see it start to come up through the leaves and it's kind of starting to turn yellow and brown and whatever. And some people, if you lived in the South, they go, okay, it's no good, I'm pulling it up. But here we go, let's watch and see what happens to this guy. And we're not letting it get wet. And we'll see how long does it take the plant to start fighting that blight, and can it fight it to the point where we get hot enough in the season that the blight stops. And most of the time it does. If we have a plant that it's just really sensitive to that disease and it overtakes it, we cross it off the list and we don't grow it the next year. We personally do not pull it up because we want to know, are the plants that are next to it resistant to that disease? So we're trying to figure out when we have something that is sensitive to a certain wilt or blight or virus, we want to know whether or not, so that we can cross it off. But most of the time, if you keep your plants dry and you keep them up off the ground, they're going to be able to fight that stuff because we're in the Central Valley of California and it's just really hot.
If you have your plants on a drip, what do you suggest as far as setting it? How much?
Oh, so there's no way to answer that, only because everybody's soil is different.
Okay.
If you go 1 mile that way, you use a lot less water than we do here because we're on sand and that's clay. If you're on clay, you're going to use a whole lot less water and you're just going to need to check it. What I would suggest,
Raised.
yeah, if you have raised beds and you did you buy topsoil and brought it in? So it's going to be loamy.
Okay.
And that's good if they mixed it, you know, they didn't sell you our topsoil because it's sand.
Right.
That it's going to have compost mixed into it, and so you've got some retention there. Our drips are set 4 days a week for 45 minutes a day, and it's 2 gallon per hour drips on each plant. Now you do the math on that. It's a lot of water because we're on sand. We are, you know, we're regenerative agriculture is a big thing for us, and so our garden is organic, and our garden, when we moved on this property, was the soil was dead and over farmed and really like no organic matter in it at all. We're doing a lot to change that, so as we get the soil healthier and get more organic matter in it, we'll be able to start lowering the amount of water that we're having to use to keep the plants healthy, and the amount of fertilizer that we have to use, because it's just leaching fertilizer out so fast. So that to say, on the situation you have, I would say start with whatever your gallon drips are, you know. Let's say you do 4 days a week for an hour and get a moisture meter.
Okay.
And then after you've watered it for 3 or 4 rotations, go stick your moisture meter in, and if it's saying it's too wet, cut it back, and if it's saying it's too dry, then add more. The mulch is going to help a lot, and like it's going to help you not lose moisture so that you're having to constantly keep putting it back in again. But it's tricky because it has everything to do with your soil. And if you are not using drip, if you're using hoses and doing like a flood around it, you want to make sure that if you scratch about 1/2 inch down, that if it's still dry 1/2 inch down, then you've waited too long. But if you're scratching 1/2 inch down and it's still moist, then you don't need to water again. And you don't want to water too much because then you're going to have to use more fertilizer. And if you have poor drained soil, you're actually going to rot the roots. So it's, you know, it's tricky, but then once you get it dialed, you know what, it's your soil. You know,
so then
what
the
you gotta
moisture
do.
meter needs to go 1/2 inch down.
No, the moisture meter goes down about 2 inches.
2 inches,
Yeah. But if you're flood watering your plants, you can just, you're like, oh, should I water this again? Is it, you know, and I don't have a moisture meter, you can scratch the surface, but it doesn't work for drips to scratch the surface because you're only watering in 2 spots or 1 spot, and it's going to go down like this, so it may be totally dry on top,
Right.
but couple inches down, it's nice and moist.
Right.
So, yeah. Any questions on that? Yeah. What is it? I've heard. Yeah. Okay, so I'm glad you brought that up. Containers are a little different. If you're buying it from someone who's packaging it, they've probably sterilized it. Containers are under a lot more stress than in the ground or in raised beds. And the sides of your containers heat up faster, so they're heating the roots up more, and it stresses the plants out faster. When it gets cold, it cools the soil down faster. You're leaching, obviously, your nutrients out a whole lot faster, because as you water, the nutrients are coming out the bottom of the pot. If you use something that isn't sterilized, that stressed plant is going to give into it. And so like potting soil, like people say, well, I'm just going to use dirt and put it in my pot, and then their plants die because that soil isn't sterilized. All potting soil that's in bags is sterilized. And it's good for pots. It's not good for like in the ground, because you want your soil to be alive, but in pots you need to have sterilized soil, or else disease is just going to take over, because it's alive in the soil, and there's good stuff alive in the soil, but the plants are too stressed. Yeah, so I would just check to make sure it's sterilized. Yeah, and you can sterilize it yourself in the oven, but it stinks your house up, so I don't recommend it. But yeah, and we've had lots of people who've failed in planter or in containers because they thought they could use garden soil. If you go to Home Depot or Lowe's and buy garden soil in the bags, garden soil is not potting soil. It's dirt mixed with compost, and it's not sterilized. Not unless it's been sterilized. And really, that's the best thing about compost, is the live stuff that's in it. And if you sterilize it, you kill all the live stuff. So it's just, to me, it would be, I don't see the benefit in it. It's kind of like eating fermented food, but cooking it first. Like, you kill all the good stuff that you're eating it for. And same for the plants. So yeah. Any other question? Okay. The other mistake that I forgot to mention in nitrogen is that one of the big mistakes that people make is they're putting lawn clippings or fresh manure around their plants, which are high in nitrogen. And so again, it's great if you're growing lettuce, but if you're growing tomatoes, you're going to get big healthy plants and no fruit. So make sure, if you don't put your lawn clippings around your tomato plants, and don't, I will also say, and I know Kaya, you have bunny rabbit.
Mm-hmm.
Bunny rabbit poop, bunny rabbits eat alfalfa. Alfalfa is really high in nitrogen. So unless that poop has been composted completely, it's too high in nitrogen for tomatoes. Good for other things, just not for tomatoes.
Question, Monique, over there.
Hey, I started, I'm Darlene.
Hi.
Hi, Darlene.
It sounds like I've done everything wrong. No wonder why this is my third year, and I'm about ready to say, you know what, I am done.
Don't give up.
I'm about ready to give up, but anyway, I have a planter.
Yeah.
I call it a box.
It's a raised bed.
A raised bed.
Uh-huh.
So I thought, hey, let's just put dirt in here, right? My parents grew great tomatoes,
Mm-hmm.
but they're retired and they're giving up the tomato business. So I thought, I've got to grow my own. So I'm thinking, okay, they planted it into the ground, right? So I just got dirt from around the property, and boom, there you go.
Uh-huh.
Number two, I was second year then, I was like, okay, it's got to be the watering. I was watering it every day. So I got the biggest plant possible, like a big fat weed,
Yes.
with little to no tomatoes, and they sucked. They tasted terrible. Right?
Yeah.
It was like, so anyway, how do we probably covered this already, because I came here late, but it's the whole idea of, do you test your dirt then?
You can, but if you've got one raised bed, I wouldn't waste the money. You know, we've tested our soil multiple times because our garden has all sorts of issues and we're trying to dial them in. But for what you have, like, you can buy a soil test and it's going to give you just the basics. But what I would say is you're not wrong by using dirt because you're raised bed, you're not planter, you're not a pot.
Right.
But that being said, like we were talking about, garden soil, which is dirt mixed with compost, is the best thing to put in those raised beds. If you've already put the dirt in there, get compost. Because you can just take the dirt and mix it with compost and now you've got garden soil.
Okay, so either get garden soil or compost.
Yes. Yeah, either garden soil, which is dirt mixed with compost, or use your own dirt and mix compost in it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one thing I did was I used manure the first year. In the second year, this last year, I used chicken.
Yeah, and chicken manure is really high in nitrogen.
Oh my God. Okay.
That's why you had big healthy plants.
Okay, so what do I do? Don't do any of them? Don't.
Yeah, it has to be if you're using manure that didn't compost, it has to be aged at least a couple years because it gives nitrogen a chance to leach out, and that's the nitrogen is the thing that gives you the big plants and
so
no
don't
fruit.
Use manure, don't use chicken poo.
Yeah,
Just
compost and tomato specific fertilizers.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
And then after that, water once a week, it sounds like.
Oh, it depends. No, it depends on how you're watering and what kind of soil you've got in there. Because
It's not
just
sandy.
yeah. So that's why we're talking about a moisture meter. Get a moisture meter. They're a couple bucks, and just check if it's saying that your moisture is good, then don't water. If it's saying it's too dry, add water. If it's saying it's too wet, cut back on your water.
So is a moisture meter kind of like I need a moisture meter for tomatoes? Like can it be?
No. That's just moisture. Like
Okay.
it. Yeah. So you, if you were growing a marsh plant, the moisture meter would have to be wetter.
Okay.
But the moisture meter works for any plants. You're just trying whatever that plant grows in, the moisture meter needs to hit in that happy zone. And for most vegetables, you're talking about in the middle. You don't want them too wet, you don't want them too dry. But
And can you plant tomatoes every year in the same spot?
no, that's another big mistake that everybody makes, and it's on my list.
Okay, got it.
So the other most common mistake that people make is planting tomatoes in the same spot every year. So there's a couple problems with that. Number one is that tomatoes are extremely heavy feeders, so they are going to steal all the nutrients from your soil. Number two, especially with heirlooms, if there is any disease at all from the year before, your plant that you're sticking in the ground is immediately going to get a shot of that disease right when you stick it in the ground.
So do you then, like for example, I have two of them. So one year I grew tomatoes on one side and I heard that, so I put on the other side.
Yeah.
And now I can go back to.
As long as there was no disease problem. Now, and we're going to get even a little bit further into that, and with the other reason you don't plant, but this isn't in planters, this is in the ground, is if you have sandy loam or sand, basically if you have anything other than hard pan and clay, especially in our area, we have root knot nematodes, and they kill tomato plants like very quickly. And the only tomato plants that are resistant, there are resistant strains of tomatoes, and we are the testing ground for root knot nematodes because we're on sand, and root knot nematodes love sand. And so, and not only do they feed on tomatoes, they feed on almond trees. Guess what this property was when we bought it?
Oh, God. Okay.
So we recently found out that farmers start fumigating for root knot nematodes at around 300 parts per million. When we did our last soil test, we were at 1,200. So any tomato that can survive on this property is nematode resistant. And some of the ones that we absolutely loved on the old property, we're now having to either get this soil to the point that we can control the nematodes, or we have to cross them off the list. And if you like pink Berkeley tie-dye, I will tell you, we're having a really hard time. We've gone 2 years and we can't keep it alive. And so it may end up going off of our list, even though it's a fantastic tomato.
So does that go? Does that go for raised beds as well? Like not planting them in the same place?
It depends on how deep. Well, yes, but as far as nematodes, not necessarily, because the
Okay.
nematodes they don't travel. So like once, let's say you've got your tomato right here, and you kept planting. This is a great place because I planted it there last year and it did awesome. So the next year you plant right there and you're like, hey, it did great. It's not quite as good, but it did great from last year. So then the next year you stick it in there again and you're like, the plant got big and then it died. Then you go to rip it out and all of the roots, instead of looking smooth, look like they have warts all over them. That's root, not nematodes. And once you've got them, it's really hard to kill them without using chemicals that are really horrible, that you wouldn't want to eat the food that is being grown in them. So it's better to avoid it than to treat it. And with your planting beds, I know, like I've seen some planting beds, some raised beds that are only this deep. Even though that's a raised bed, your tomato roots go down this far. If you're planting in the same spot and you've got sandy soil, eventually you're going to get root knot nematodes right there. And as soon as that tomato reaches down to that spot, it's going to kill them.
So if you only have limited locations in which to plant them, should I plant them every other year?
No, what I would say is, depending on the size of your beds, is because they don't travel, they only travel as far as the roots reached. So if, like in square foot gardening, you have this square foot and you planted a tomato there and the roots barely reached beyond that foot, move a foot over and plant there. With a lot of these really big tomatoes, what I suggest is plant your tomato right on the edge of the raised bed so that the growth can go this way and not crush the rest of the bed this way, and you can't grow anything else in the bed because the tomatoes are there, and then just move over. So when you go to pull your plants up at the end of the year, take note of how far those roots reached, and wherever the next year, put your tomato over where there weren't roots in that area, and you won't have the nematodes there. Yeah.
How far apart do you recommend to plant them if they're going to be in a raised bed?
Tomatoes 3 feet apart, peppers and eggplants 2 feet apart, and they are going to hug each other by the end of the season with the tomatoes, unless they're like some of the dwarf varieties that we're growing that only get this big, and they're cute as can be. But for regular tomatoes, like if 3 feet apart, you're like, wow, that seems really big apart. It's like all these redwood trees everybody's planting and they're like this, and then 2 years later they're all like crushed up against each other. Your plants are going to grow and they're going to completely take up that space. And remember, you want airflow. So if you're planting them too close together, not only are they competing for nutrients, but they're also cutting down your airflow so that you have more disease. Yeah.
Well, have you talked about sun yet?
Yes. No, I have not. But
Okay.
let's talk about sun.
Because I got peppers from here, a whole bunch of different. They produced tons. They were good, and then I noticed they looked like they got sunburned.
Sunburn is.
They were like just the top of them.
Are you talking about the plants or the fruit?
The fruit.
The fruit. Okay. And that's possible because that's just, you don't have enough foliage to cover the fruit. And usually what I'll do is, if I have a really nice tomato that's starting to form and it doesn't have any leaves around it, I'll pull some leaves over.
Okay.
Move some of the plant over to cover it, because they're going to do a lot better if they're not having sun hit them hard. If it's on the north side of the plant, you're probably not going to have a problem because it doesn't get a lot of sun over there. But if it's on the south side, you are. And if you're doing rows, it's better to do them where they're running north-south, where like we run our rows this way. So the sun is going like this and it's hitting the plants all day long, where if you run the rows this way, these guys are getting sun. These guys are not getting sun because these guys are going to grow up and they're going to shade them. So running your east-west, running your rows east-west.
What's the minimum amount of sun you need?
Minimum for tomatoes is 6 hours of full-on sun. Better 8 to 12 hours. And these late varieties, some of the late varieties that we carry, if they're not getting at least 8 hours, they're not gonna produce for you. By the time they are producing fruit, you're getting into fall, and the cold weather is going to stop them. So you need to have them out in the open sun. Now the difference for that is if you're growing early varieties in this ridiculous Central Valley heat, is take your early varieties and put them somewhere where they get late afternoon shade, because they're going to stress when it gets up to 100 degrees plus, and they'll stop producing. And you can just hang on, wait till fall, and then they'll start producing again. Or if you tuck them somewhere where they get a little bit of shade, then they'll keep producing for the whole season. Just because they're an early doesn't mean they won't keep producing, as long as you can keep them from getting too hot. Now, that being said, because it's the Central Valley, one of our downsides to growing tomatoes is it gets too hot. And when we get above 100 degrees and it stretches out multiple days and it doesn't cool down into the 60s at night, the plants, in order to preserve themselves, will drop their blossoms. And so you go out and you're like, oh, look at all my blossoms, and it's like really hot, and then 3 days later you come out and all your blossoms are on the ground. The plant is trying to survive the extreme heat. What we do is cover them with shade cloth. If you were here for the tomato tasting, you saw all of our vines had shade cloth across the top of them, and that lowers the temperature just enough that we don't lose our blossoms. And I recommend, because it's the Central Valley, and that doesn't, like the early varieties are the most sensitive, but all varieties, when you get up to 106, 8, 10, and it's 75 degrees at night, they're gonna drop their blossoms because they're trying to survive. The other thing is that, and we hear this every year, is in early spring, like right now, we're putting our plants in, they're growing like crazy, they got blossoms all over them, and then the blossoms fall off. And you know it's not because of heat, because it hasn't been hot enough. And it's because of extreme temperature changes with short days. So again, the plant is stressing and is trying to survive in fluctuating temperatures, and so it'll drop its blossoms. Usually, like for us, because you know, this is where, like last year in May, we had a freeze. I can't remember a time that ever happened in May. And we were out here throwing frost fabric over our plants to try to save them, because any tomato plant will die in below freezing temperatures. But you'll have a day where it's like the high is 50 degrees and the low is 45 degrees. And the plant's like, I'm okay with that. But then the next day it's 80 degrees and then it drops down to 40 degrees. And so, you know, this time of year, the plants, and they can't bounce back because our days are shorter. So they just start dropping blossoms. There's a product called Blossom Set. It's a hormone, and you can buy it at Walmart, Home Depot, or online. And it's in a spray bottle. And if you only have a couple plants, it's no big deal, but you go around and you spray them, and it causes them to hold onto the blossom a little bit longer, so that it gives it a chance to pollinate. Because once it pollinates, then it'll set fruit, and the fluctuating temperatures aren't going to hurt the fruit. It just hurts the blossoms. So it's a way to help that. We could never use enough of that stuff in our garden with as many plants as we have. So when we get those fluctuating temps and the plants drop their blossoms, we're like, now we got to wait a little bit longer to get fruit. Because you're talking about a couple weeks difference from the time, like if you drop those blossoms, those fruits would have been ready a couple weeks earlier than if they have to set new blossoms. So you're only back by, it's not like, oh, my season's completely lost because I lost all my blossoms. It's just the plant has to recover and then set new blossoms. So it's not the end of the world. Now with peppers, this is a little different, and this is one of the mistakes that we hear every year that people make. You want to grow bell peppers, but they never produce, and the reason is they don't like heat. Hot peppers, the spicy peppers, like heat, and a lot of the like sweet banana pepper and some of the ones that are just, they're sweet but they're not a bell pepper, they handle the heat here fine. But bell peppers specifically do better in cooler temperatures than what we are in the Central Valley. We grow great bell peppers. We cover them with shade cloth. And because we're growing them in these kind of cages, I have like just little squares of shade cloth, because you don't want to cover the whole entire thing, because they need pollinators to pollinate your flowers, because remember they have a male and female flower. So if you cover the whole entire thing with shade cloth, now the pollinators can't get in there and pollinate, and you won't get fruit from that. So you just take a square. I usually have them where they go down to about here, a shade cloth, and I use clothespins. And I just clothespin around them, and that gives them enough shade that the bell peppers will produce. Yeah.
So if a pepper is a tiny little thing,
Mm-hmm.
then it will grow to be a big thing like you see in stores. What does that mean?
It could be the variety. Like Yummy Orange Bell on our list is one of our favorite. It's a mini bell. It's only this big. It's like the cocktail peppers you get at Costco that are all different colors. So it kind of looks like a fat jalapeno, but it's like super sweet and bright orange. That's as big as it gets. So if you buy a Yummy Orange Bell and you're like, I thought I was going to get this big blocky pepper, it naturally doesn't grow into a big blocky pepper.
Would it be too much sun too? 'Cause that,
Well, it won't. That's varietal, like, so that you can't change how that grows. But if you are planting like yellow monster bell,
yeah,
they're like this big.
exactly.
If you're getting little tiny ones, they're getting too much heat. They don't have enough nutrients. There's a lot of things that could cause them to not grow any bigger. But I can tell you, living in the Central Valley, we've grown yellow orange bell or a yellow monster bell for years, and it's a huge pepper. And they have to be staked because they'll just snap the branches right off because the peppers are so big. And we can grow them in our heat with shade cloth.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. Planting for the diseases, we've touched on a couple. We've already talked about blossom drop. Frost fabric, if you've seen, we have them for sale in there. That's this nice light fluffy stuff. This is what they use for row covers that farmers use to cover up things that are damaged by frost. So they'll put it over in the early part of the season and then pull it up later on. With the cages, when we used to use the cages, we always wrapped all of our cages. We put our plants in March and April. We wrapped all of the cages with frost fabric, and then we left it on there until the plants were pushing up against the sides, because this breathes, so it doesn't get too hot. It will just keep frost from killing your plants. If you use plastic, all you have to have is like 15 minutes of the sun out in March, and you will fry that plant. So the nice thing with these guys is you're not running out and going, oh my gosh, the sun came out, and you're trying to take the plastic off. You can just leave this stuff on, and it will protect them from frost.